Welcome to our Q&A. And I want to thank Max in particular, who produces the show, along with Sophia, Thomas, and Diego, who has relentlessly pushed up our numbers on YouTube, which is important because that subscriber base becomes the foundation by which you can hit a fairly large group of people. And of course, when my show was canceled on the Real News, we started pretty much at zero. So he's done an amazing job. We're going to begin with the questions are great, by the way. We didn't have a theme tonight. This is from Peter Stevenson. You said in a previous Q&A that resistance in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds was necessary for the sake of one's soul, and that, quote, the soul is real, end quote. Can you talk about that? That gets into my entire orientation towards the world, towards injustice, towards those forces that seek to dominate our lives. And I come out, of course, of a religious tradition. It was the religious left. My father, Presbyterian minister, was very close to the Catholic Worker, and Daniel and Phil Berrigan, who ran Concerned Clergy and Laity Against the War during the Vietnam anti-war protests, and he was involved in the civil rights movement. And I think it's different, perhaps, in many ways from the secular left, with maybe the exception of Camus, who considered himself an atheist. And it is that to battle malignant forces, or, if we're going to use the Kantian term radical evil, is what we are called to do in life, with the very real understanding that life itself is brief, relatively. I mean, I'm 68, it went pretty fast. And that evil will exist long after we're here. In the Christian paradigm, it's called bearing the cross. And I think in Garrow's biography of King, which is called Bearing the Cross, King, of course, had a doctorate in theology from Boston University. He does a very good job of explaining that orientation that King had, and that you don't measure life by empirically what you achieve. I wrote a column about the great radical feminist and socialist Lee Lakeman, who we lost a few weeks ago, and I called her in hospice. It's called Lee Lakeman and the Whoredom of the Left. And she said, everything you and I have fought for in life is worse. But that doesn't invalidate what we stood for and what we did. There's I thought quite a thoughtful book by a criminologist called Why We Kill. And he does a study of people who have committed acts of extreme violence and murder. And he talks about phantoms, that most of these people, of course, grew up in households where violence was endemic, and that these phantoms, essentially figures, even after they were gone, determined largely how they responded to people and to stimuli around them. But I think there are also phantoms that keep us, that we can't betray. My father would be one, but phantoms where we see people who have stood up to do what is right, and that they've paid a heavy cost for it. And our fealty and loyalty is to that stance, regardless of the consequences. I actually think it's a better way to respond to the forces of radical evil, because it insulates you from the highs and lows which are endemic within consumer society. And so, who are the great writers on that? Daniel Berrigan, without question, who baptized my youngest daughter. The Great Radical Priest, No Bars for Manhood is a great book, or Thomas Merton would be another one, or that Garrow book. And so, yeah, things are worse than they were. And most of what I've spent my life fighting for, I mean, we can talk about Gaza, are worse. And I don't see that they're going to get better. I don't see any outside impediment to stop Israel from its punishing and inhuman treatment of the Palestinians in Gaza, who don't have clean water, they don't have medicine, they don't have shelter. I mean, they are orchestrating a catastrophic humanitarian disaster on purpose, and neither forces in Europe or certainly the Trump administration has any intent to stop them. But that doesn't invalidate, the fight on behalf for Palestinian justice. I spent 14 years decrying the persecution of Julian Assange, and to be honest, I didn't think he would get out. But it didn't. We were relentless, and it was really because of the mass movements in Australia that put pressure on the Australian government that finally did free him. And thank God he is free, and he is in Australia. But I never let that, bleak view of, or my bleak view, inhibit in the constant campaign on my part to do everything possible to publicize his crucifixion, and including on my own money, flew to London to cover his court cases. And there finally, after 14 years, he's free, thank God. So, but he wouldn't be free if there weren't all sorts of people who pushed him. I mean, it wasn't the benevolence of the Biden or any other administration. It was this constant worldwide pressure against, I would argue, probably the greatest journalist of our generation. TXM, it appears that many in the mainstream left are appalled at Trump's handling of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They paint Putin as a man who wants to invade all of Europe and therefore must be stopped by the U.S. What are they getting wrong? And do you think Trump may have walked us back a few inches from a nuclear conflict with Russia? Well, I've never understood the left's embrace of the war with Russia and Ukraine, or embrace of Ukraine. And maybe that's because I was in Eastern Europe and Central Europe and when the Berlin Wall came down. So I was acutely aware of the promises that had been made to Mikhail Gorbachev, that because they couldn't reunify Germany unless there was acquiescence from the Soviet Union. And the promises were explicit from Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the then German foreign minister, and James Baker, who was Secretary of State, that NATO would not be expanded beyond the borders of a unified Germany. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union and this fantasy on the part of American imperialists that we now had a unipolar world, in essence, the United States could do whatever it wanted, coupled with the fact that the big arms manufacturers could make billions, have made billions, reconfiguring the military and the old Warsaw Pact to make their militaries compatible with NATO, we violated all of those promises. And the Ukraine was always the red line. And people, the historical trauma that the Russian people have felt is real. They were invaded largely through the Ukraine 3 different times, first, of course, by Napoleon, but then in the First and the Second World War. There's a WikiLeaks leaked a memo that was written by William Burns, who was then U.S. ambassador in Moscow, later became the head of the CIA, who said across the political spectrum, there's no division, I'm paraphrasing, left or right, that incorporating NATO or incorporating Ukraine into NATO is something that all Russians find unpalatable. And think about it. We're kind of baiting China, but think about if Chinese warships were going up and down along the California coast, or if in the old Soviet Union, Mexico became part of the Warsaw Pact, how we would react. Now, that doesn't excuse the invasion, which was a war crime. I was working at RT at the time, and I denounced it as a war crime. On the other hand, it was a completely preventable war. The persecution of the ethnic Russians in Ukraine was real. The ascendancy of fascist Bandera-loving Ukrainians is real, despite the fact that Zelensky is, of course, Jewish. So yeah, it was a war that never needed to have happened. Putin took the bait, but very early on in the war, Henry Kissinger, of all people, who of course I loathe, correctly said that the war has to be stopped. There has to be an exchange of land for peace. Otherwise, we are flirting with a nuclear disaster. And so I do support the Trump efforts to end the conflict, although I watched the clip of Trump and Vance with Zelensky, and I felt it was appalling. I mean, they were thugs. I think that the motivation of the Trump administration to end the war is because they admire Putin and the autocratic system he set up. It's one they want to set up. And I don't see, I mean, many say that, or, I think the argument is that he's taken on the deep state. And that's another discussion, and I've written about it. And I think that's a big mistake. And there's a column, I forget the name of it, it's called something like The Deep State and the Road to Fascism, or something like that, Road to Dictatorship, but it's on the Substack. So I won't go into all of that argument now. But all totalitarian systems seek to disembowel the previous bureaucratic structure. And it's not that they are essentially freeing us from the excesses or even criminality of the FBI or anyone else. It's that they're making sure that the goons that are there are personally loyal to them. And that was true. I mean, that's what the fascists did in Germany. It's what the Bolsheviks did in the aftermath of the revolution in Tsarist Russia. It's what the Iranians did as soon as they overthrew the Shah. That's classic. And that's what's happening. So yeah, I don't understand I find the response by many in the left, including people I admire and like, just extremely naive. Where we're headed, and I'm no friend of the deep state, of course. And many of the critiques of the deep state I share. But these mechanisms of internal control are now being handed over, let's say in the FBI, to people whose complete and utter loyalty is to the figure of Trump, of the demagogue. And there, what little separation of powers there were, just like the social services. I mean, Head Start has been eviscerated. All of the programs that we have, which are very minimal compared to what most industrial nations have, those are being destroyed. The Consumer Protection Agency, EPA, and everything else. So I'm a little stunned at how the left has responded. This is Reverend Edmund Bolea. Chris, why do you see so many liberals experiencing Schadenfreude over a Trump victory? Also, how can we break through this and revive a class-based economic activism? Well, that's it. And I mean, I was just out in Seattle with Shama Sawant, and you can watch that talk and watch Shama's talk. Shama's great. We'll post her talk on Substack. And I think we got diverted with the boutique activism of woke politics and virtue signaling, and forgot that this is about class warfare. As Ralph Nader frequently said to me, we got to stop asking people whether they voted for Trump or not. We got to organize unions to fight Walmart. And it doesn't matter whether they voted for Trump or they didn't vote for Trump or they didn't vote. Because once you engage in that confrontation with the real centers of power, that's an education of itself. And the viciousness of those centers of power is an education of itself. So you begin to understand where real power lies. And Shama's attempting to build militant unions and eventually, hopefully, third party built out of labor. And that's been the problem with the Green Party and other third parties, that they've been divorced from labor, and that's just going nowhere. Any successful third party movement has to be rooted in labor, because the only weapon we have, or the only strength we have, are our numbers, and the only weapon we have is the strike. And of course, they just had a nationwide strike in Greece, as Sophia just told me. That's exactly, and that is exactly how to hold power accountable, or even hold power hostage. Mutualist, have you read or have any opinions on either Benjamin Tucker or Proudhon? I've read Proudhon, but I don't know that I'm. I mean, I read Proudhon a long time ago, so I don't know that I'm going to start a lecture on Proudhon. I'd have to go back and check my underlinings and notes. Walkman, what YouTube channels are good to stay tuned to? Do you think YouTube will continue to be a good source of information in the coming years? Well, somebody who gets demonetized on YouTube, I'm worried. I think there are good programs on, good commentaries on YouTube. The Gray Zone does good stuff. Amy on Democracy Now! Can do good stuff. I mean, all of these are available on YouTube. You can get David Harvey, if you want to get good, solid, serious lectures on Marx, that's where you go. So yeah, there is good stuff on there. But we know from shadow banning and the algorithms that, should at any point we become seen as a kind of serious threat, we can instantly be shut down, because these are not public entities. They're held by private corporations that have very deep ties and links to the national security state. Kevin Katwas, are you concerned about the tech oligarchs' vision of the future? They openly espouse a pseudo-religious faith in transhumanism, a belief that we can create an AI god and merge with it, transcending our humanity and becoming gods ourselves. It sounds insane, but these people openly discuss this and hold immense power and wealth. Is this a false religion? Well, yes, it's definitely a false religion. I am deeply concerned about the power and misuse of AI, and this whole fantasy of transhumanism, which I don't think is ever attainable. So yeah, all of those are, really frightening. So this is athletically smart. Norman Finkelstein recently argued that Trump doesn't need fascism like the Nazis because he has no real opposition. He has a majority in Congress and controls the Supreme Court. What are your thoughts? He does have an opposition within the deep or bureaucratic state, and that's why he's purging it. So if you look at the early years of both the Bolsheviks and the fascists in Germany, it took them several years to consolidate power, because they had to dismantle bureaucratic structures that were not loyal to the party. And there were a lot of court battles, which in the beginning the Nazis lost. There was hostile press in both early Nazi Germany as well as in the early years of the Bolshevik seizure of power. But gradually they were dismantled and destroyed. And I think that's the process that we're watching. So endemic within the bureaucratic structures, there are forces that seek or would like to obstruct the unilateral or dictatorial power that Trump and those around him are trying to achieve. And that's why we're seeing the assault on the deep state. And the replacement, well, there's two things going on. They're harvesting. They're firing lots and lots of people. That's, of course, about privatization. There's 1 million civilian employees working for the Pentagon. They would like to I think they got rid of 5,000 of them, but they would like to get rid of most of them, and then you contract out, because that's how these corporations make money. I mean, it's interesting if you read Karl Marx that he talks about the late stage of capitalism, where unregulated predatory capitalism, disembowels the country and finally cannibalizes the very structures that permit capitalism to exist. And that, I think, is a good analogy for what is happening. This is our man. It seems that there has been an assumption for many in the independent media that because Trump and Musk are dismantling many of the tools of the deep state, that they are actually crippling U.S. empire and inhibiting capital's ability to wage war. It seems more like they plan to further centralize and privatize these powers based on the military contractors within the Trump administration. What are your thoughts on this take that Trump is actually destroying the grip that intelligence agencies and Wall Street have on foreign policy? So late empire, any empire, is you see these. I mean, the Roman Empire would be an example, but you see these buffoonish figures, or the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It doesn't really matter, and they actually destroy out of ignorance. They destroy the structures that make empire possible. And I wrote a column about this called "The Empire Self-Destructs," with this amazing cartoon by Mr. Fish, by Dwayne, of Trump dressed as Captain America in a suicide vest. And that's what's happening. And the perfect example of that is USAID. So they go after USAID because they believe that the American government is pouring, I don't know what the budget is, but, significant amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, into humanitarian aid. Well, that's not how AID works. AID, I know, I was overseas for 20 years. AID is an important part of the arm of imperial power. How does it work? Well, you only get aid if you adhere to the dictates of the empire. And if you don't, they have all sorts of programs. The National Institute for Democracy. I got that wrong, I think. But anyway, they set up programs that, like with Evo Morales in Bolivia, that fund opposition groups to overthrow power they consider too independent or hostile. And, they use that money to go after, and those programs to go after Jeremy Corbyn, which Matt Kennard writes about in his book, The Racket. It's a form of bribery. So, for instance, AID helped Haiti rebuild the airport in Port-au-Prince, but they demanded that Haiti, among other things, slash taxes and customs in these kind of industrial free zones that AID also helped build the infrastructure for, but also to vote against allowing Cuba into the Organization of American States. So it's an arm of power. Before AID, it used to actually be part of the CIA. It was covert. Now it's just out in the open. And so watching them destroy AID, for me, was an example of how they don't understand the machinery of empire and how it works. They, of course, worship empire. You saw it with Trump and Vance and Zelensky. They love the power that empire gives them, but they actually don't know how to manage it. And I think that is part of the anxiety, or even hysteria on the part of the deep state. They realize these people are not capable of managing the empire, and that is characteristic of late empire. Those who finally take power actually eviscerate the very mechanisms of empire, or the Leviathan that they worship. Pete Barron Marx talked about the need to avoid organizing for vulgar socialism, higher wages, better working conditions, and called for revolutionary organizing instead. What do you think is needed now? Well, that here I'd have to turn to Lenin. who understood that if he wanted to mobilize the working class, higher wages and better working conditions were key. And there are all sorts of deviations between Lenin and Marx, and that's one of them. I mean, Lenin, by the way, I consider a fascinating figure, but absolutely amoral. And of course, he destroyed the Soviets, which was that one moment from roughly 1917 to 1918 when workers controlled their own workplaces under the banner of all power to the Soviets, which meant all power to the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party. And so I think that appealing to the material interests of the working class is absolutely key, as Lenin understood. And very few people organize for the idealism that Marx held out. Peter A. I work a professional job. Nevertheless, I see unbelievably low union involvement. How does grassroots union involvement increase? How do we get the nation to engage in a general strike? We won't get a general strike until we rebuild individual labor movements. And I mean, the key is Amazon. The two keys are Amazon and Walmart. So these are huge employers. Amazon has built a very sophisticated system to break union organizing. But I think those are the two companies we have to focus on because they employ such a large amount of the workforce, and because shutting them down in a strike would have significant economic effects. But these have strike, like Walmart has strike breaking teams. So does Amazon. It's not going to be a very easy battle. The media is not on our side, so there's not a kind of public consciousness. But of course, the media is corporate owned. I mean, Bezos owns the Washington Post and just denuded the opinion page. Wasn't very good, but still he denuded it. This is Kai Bain. Was this movement to totalitarianism inevitable even without Trump? Yes. And that was certainly the theme of my books for the last 15 or 20 years. Death of the Liberal Class, Empire of Illusion, Wages of Rebellion, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, that I wrote with Joe Sacco, American Fascists, The Christian Right and the War in America, America, the Farewell Tour, was all warning that we were moving inevitably towards a totalitarian system because of the pronounced social inequality and the consequences of that. And that's something that has been understood by political theorists going all the way back to Aristotle, that you can't sustain an open society democracy when you have unprecedented wealth that creates unprecedented poverty. Fellow traveler, you're a huge inspiration to me, and I love your books. Thank you. I'm a U.S. civil servant. I'm constantly plagued with indecision and anxiety. How do you stay so measured during these times? I don't know how measured I've been. I mean, the genocide in Gaza has been pretty awful for me to ingest because I spent so much time in Gaza, and I think also because I was in Sarajevo in the war, so I know what it feels like to be shelled with hundreds of shells a day, although Gaza is worse. Probably coming out of war zones, coming out of disintegrating societies, I suppose, conditioned me in a way to face that kind of bleakness. I think I have a pretty good understanding, having been in war, of the dark side of human nature. And so I'm not surprised. I mean, I don't have many expectations that go unfulfilled because my expectations are very meager. So I don't know if that answers it. David Reek, communities form parallel governments as was done by the Catalonians during the Spanish Civil War. Would community co-ops undermine the oligarchy? Yes. The more parallel institutions that we can create, the more independence we have. And that includes food, by the way. So yes. Although, let's be clear, the POUM or the anarchists were crushed by the communist government, at that point backed by Stalin, and that's all detailed in George Orwell's book, Homage to Catalonia. That's a good question. this is Pacheco Ron, were Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan skillfully managing the empire? No. Ukraine would be an example. They were cheerleaders for the disastrous military adventurism, 20 years of it in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. So no, they weren't. They were contributing to the combustion or collapse of empire. I mean, one of the things about Trump is that there's kind of inadvertently, there's an honesty there. So Blinken and Sullivan and Brett McGurk and all these figures, they knew full well that Israel had turned Gaza into a moonscape. I mean, Israel's dropped more than twice the tonnage of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on Gaza. And Gaza's only 20 miles long and 5 miles wide. And they knew full well that the intent was the depopulation or ethnic cleansing of Gaza. They just didn't say it. Trump is putting out videos of, Gaza is the Riviera of the Middle East. So, there's more honesty, I suppose. Remember, Blinken on his first trip to the Middle East walked around with quotas. He went to Sisi in Egypt and Abdullah and Jordan and said, okay, we want you to take, I think with Sisi it was 1.1 million Palestinians and 700,000 in Iraq. I don't remember. So he was just a bag carrier for Netanyahu. So it's not just Trump and Marco Rubio and Vance who are imploding the empire. That's been a long time coming. Reverend Dr. Abu Haram. Chris, was I right in feeling a little cynical about the surprise revolutionary telethon that happened in Seattle after you recently spoke? I got up and left. I suppose you're referring to their effort to raise money. That's a tactic. I don't love it myself, but I had no part of it. In fact, I paid my own way out there. They didn't pay for it. So I already handed them probably the largest sum singly that they gathered at that event. This is Ziki. Chris, the World Economic Forum recently said that the public has lost trust in elites and that the elites needed to rebrand to regain their trust. Do you think it's possible that Musk and company actually do understand how CIA fronts like USAID work, but instead recognize that the Trump administration needs to act like their anti-establishment in order to maintain the trust of their populist-leaning base in order to usher in more corporatization? I don't think these people do understand how empire works. That's their, they understand how to make money. And how to game the system to make money. And let's be clear, Musk makes a lot of his money off of federal contracts. But no, I don't think they have a sense of how the empire functions. And I think that's why there's this deep animus within the deep state, which is created to run and maintain empire towards the Trump administration. Walkman, what advice do you have for people who want to pursue journalism? Seems to be a lot of chaos in the industry these days. Do you recommend journalism school? Also, any great novels you suggest leftists to read? Well, I mean, journalism is a dying profession, like the ministry. I mean, I guess I chose both. It's the old model by which journalism existed doesn't function. It's broken. And what was that model? It was connecting. The news organization was the intermediary that connected sellers with buyers. They don't need that intermediary. They have all of our profiles and can target us directly. So how do you, I mean, Barbara Ehrenreich used to say journalists just have to begin to accept the fact that they're going to be poor. But it costs money to do reporting. That's the problem. In addition to having to pay the rent, I did some work for a while as an investigative reporter for the New York Times, actually covered Al-Qaeda out of Paris. and it was extremely expensive. I didn't pay for it, obviously. The New York Times did. So yeah, I worry about the collapse of journalism, and I don't think we've yet found a model. The alternative press has always been a very important part of American journalism, and that it's kept the American legacy press honest. I remember Sidney Schanberg, who, if you've ever seen the movie The Killing Fields, it was about him and Death Prawn. Was also a friend of mine. He said, "Well," Sidney once said to me, "We may not have made things better, but maybe we stopped things from getting worse." That's probably a good description of the legacy press. But yes, I don't have a quick answer for that, because I don't think public funding. I mean, look at NPR; it's awful. And I used to work for NPR when it wasn't awful, many years ago. I don't know that. I mean, the internet and digital platforms like this one are good, um, but there isn't a lot of reporting on it, and I worry about whole sections of the country going dark. Courts not being covered, police, and of course, local media has atrophied or died. Um, and once that spotlight is taken away, however imperfect the coverage was, then corruption becomes an epidemic. So yeah, I'm very, very worried about it. Sunil Kapoor, do you think Trump should be given some credit for his perspective on Ukraine, as he seems to be critical of NATO military expansionism, military industrial complex, contrasted with the usual White House position on such matters? Yes, I'm in agreement. I didn't like the beating up on Zelensky in the White House. I thought that was really inappropriate. But I also have, from the inception, opposed the proxy war in Ukraine, because it was a very cynical war. It was one that American military planners knew Ukraine could never win. But it wasn't designed for Ukraine to win. It was designed to degrade the Russian military and isolate Putin in Europe. And in that, they succeeded. And the cost for the Ukrainians and Ukrainian people was devastating. So it was always a very cynical process, as all proxy wars are. I covered many proxy wars. So yeah, I think that, but I think that the motivation towards ending the war in Ukraine, and it doesn't really matter what the motivation is. Ending the war is a good thing, but I think the motivation is because the Trump administration admires the Russian autocracy under Putin, would like to emulate it, and build an alliance with a fellow autocrat the same way they do with Orban or anywhere else. I mean, this is the club. Netanyahu would be another one. But yeah, I have long opposed the perpetuation of the war in Ukraine. Sean Boyd, the U.S. empire is really about money primarily, and seems intent to simply wipe out as many of the 99% as needed. I don't see mass movements stopping the 1% U.S. class, but only bricks making the dollar nearly worthless. If true, what happens to the 99% in the world? I think we have the power if we regain that kind of militancy, and recognize that the two-party system is broken, and that but I was in London a while ago, raising money for my friend Roger Hallam, who founded Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. They shut down the M25 motorway around London, and even though Roger was all he did was in the planning stages. He wasn't even actually on the M25, but they put him in prison for 5 years. I visited him. I just got an email from him, actually, which my students in prison can't send emails, but I guess in the UK you can. So it shows how frightened the elites are. I mean, if we have the capacity to obstruct and shut down the system, to shut down the mechanisms by which they make money. If we want to use it, they will be very, very unforgiving. So, I mean, you're right about the dollar. I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to speculate on that. But many people who know more than I do talk about the eventual collapse of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and that will be catastrophic. Economically, we know what happened when the pound sterling was dropped. as the world's reserve currency in the UK. The British economy went into a death spiral, and we would as well. People wouldn't buy our treasury bonds, so the empire would be forced to contract. Some people like Alfred McCoy, a great historian, are talking, I think, 2030 or giving it a date. I think that's always dangerous. But yeah, we're moving towards that. And that would be the death blow of the American empire. And it's certainly something countries like China, Russia, Iran are working very hard to achieve. Shire, would there be anything that you would update from your book, America, the Farewell Tour? No, because that was a book so it came out of the sociologist Emil Durkheim. And Durkheim wrote a book in, I think it was 1898, called Suicide, fascinating book, in which he asked the question, what is it that drives individuals or groups to commit suicide? And that's where you get the term enemy. And he argues that it's those people, the social bonds that knit them to the society, and work is a fundamental aspect of the social bonds. Once you're severed from those society, it engenders pathologies that are self-destructive, including suicide. So in America, the Farewell Tour, I'd already argued in other books about the consequences of unfettered, unregulated capitalism, social inequality, and deindustrialization, all that stuff. And so there, I focused on the pathologies that what they call diseases of despair. So it was gambling, sexual sadism, suicide, and hate groups, or right wing. I was with the 3%ers, because Durkheim writes that those who seek the annihilation of others are driven by feelings or longings for self-annihilation. I was actually with them, had kind of echoes of, I don't know, a Hitler youth encampment or something. I was actually with them in the woods outside of Binghamton, New York, and they had a giant bonfire. And of course, there were guns all over the place. And I just was praying that nobody would Google me. And then from the other side of the bonfire, all these guys started pointing at me. So, yeah, I didn't run to the car, but I got out of there as fast as I could. So, yeah, I think that book was an attempt to look at these self-destructive pathologies that are eating away at the American eating away at American society, including on gambling. It was written out of Trump's casino long before Trump announced. Kayara, Irish media have started advocating for Ireland to drop its neutrality stance that we've had since the founding of the Irish state. What is NATO's plan for Ireland? Thank you for your brilliant work. Well, thank you. Well, that would be horrible. I mean, NATO should have been disbanded after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the idea that NATO is a defensive organization is ridiculous. Ask any Iraqi or Afghan if NATO is a defensive organization, or ask, all of the peoples in Eastern and Central Europe who have watched NATO creep directly up to the Russian border and the kind of antagonisms that it has created. So NATO, once the Soviet Union collapsed, should have been demolished. It should have been folded. It should have. And I don't buy the thing that Russia wants to invade Europe. There were long, or many statements coming out of Moscow, pleading with NATO not to keep expanding up to the border of Russia, and warning that there were consequences, all of which were ignored. There were promises made. Clinton, for instance, promised not to deploy missiles in Eastern and Central Europe, and then, of course, he violated that promise. I mean, we would have not have reacted any differently, if they had been doing the same thing in Mexico or Canada. Alex B., what is your opinion on the danger of techno-fascists using Nick Land's dark enlightenment to mutate capitalism into techno-feudalism? I don't know Nick Land's dark enlightenment, but I did do a segment with Yanis Varoufakis on his book, Techno-Feudalism. Is that the title of it, Sophia? Techno-Feudalism. So watch it. And he knows a lot more than I do. And that is what he argues is the wave of the future. I think he's probably right. Jason Rattray, how much influence will Project 2025 have during Trump's tenure? Will it decimate the middle class? Everything they're doing comes out. I just bought it. It's really a slog. I'm trying to read it. But Project 2025 is the blueprint. And that's the difference between the first Trump administration and the second, in that the first one was just chaos. There was no direction. There was no focus. It's not that Trump has focus. I don't think half the time he probably has a very vague notion of these executive orders he's signing with his Sharpie, but they're ready. And they have a very clear vision of what they want to do. And it's all available. And it's frightening. So yeah, I think that the Project 2025 has clearly become the central agenda of the Trump administration. This is Elizabeth A. Thank you for your work and integrity. Thank you. Can you recommend your most eye-opening reads? Of somebody asked earlier about, I mean, it's hard. I read a lot. Somebody asked about novels. I like Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, and I have taught it to my students in the prison. Don't read the abridged. I got all 3 volumes. Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate, I may have mentioned. I love Proust. I've read In Search of Lost Time, I think 3 times. First time during the war in Bosnia. I like Joseph Conrad quite a bit. I mean, there's so many great writers in terms of fiction. In terms of nonfiction, George Orwell is huge. Collected letters, essays, and journalism of Orwell, but then also his books, Down and Out in Paris and London, Homage to Catalonia, Whig and Peer. Of course, 1984, Animal Farm. Yeah, I mean, it's almost too... I mean, in terms of political philosophy, I mentioned Sheldon Wolin many times, Democracy Incorporated. I mean, I always say I know I've read just enough of Marx to make it look like I know something about Marx, but I think Marx is important. I did not read all the volumes of Capital. I did read the first one. It's tough. But I think, Marx certainly understands the nature of capitalism and the machinery of capitalism and how it works. I don't know that there are many who've done as exhaustive a study as Marx and Engels. This is from CB. I'm a huge fan of your work. You're an inspiration. Thanks. What role, if any, does religion or spirituality play in resistance in this moment? Well, I think at the beginning of this, I answered that with the first question. For me, it's key. And it severs us from, empirically what we achieve. And that's going to be key, because I don't think that things are going to get better, certainly not in the short term. So this is Charlie Drown. Thanks for everything. Why wouldn't the ruling class just continue sucking off the poor and working class incrementally? Aren't they threatening the whole racket? Well, that's actually a good question, because they don't have any internal impediments. There's no internal regulation. And so they actually end up destroying the very system that enriches them. Because there's no without external forms of regulation or control, the way they're built is to extract more and more and more. And if you look at late empires, I mean, whether it's the Aztec, whether it's anywhere else, what happens is that the ruling class retreats into their version of the Forbidden City or Versailles, and continues to extract disproportionate amounts of wealth from an immiserated population and a devastated environment, which ultimately leads to collapse. And we're certainly replicating that. And we didn't talk about the climate crisis, but that's fundamental. So everything is a commodity that they exploit until exhaustion or collapse without external forces to stop them. That's their nature. That's what they do. But unfettered and unregulated, they end up essentially committing collective suicide. The slick ghost, in all honesty, I don't see the people of the United States standing up due to the complacency in their lives. They won't truly recognize the loss of freedom until it's gone, and then it'll be too late and won't be regained. Yeah, I mean, I think in many societies, and this was certainly true in the Soviet Union, it was true in fascist Germany. By the time people, this is a theme that Solzhenitsyn keeps hitting, that by the time people realize what's happened, it's too late. And I don't know that we're going to be any exception. So that, and then you're just shackled. That the opportunities you had while they were consolidating power to resist are lost because they have monolithic control. Yeah, that's a big concern of mine. David L. Between the internet, work, taking care of a parent, and my dog, my attention span is wrecked. Suggestions for developing a reading habit. Well, turn off the internet. I mean, I have social media accounts, but fortunately for me, Max runs it. I have a Facebook page. I've never seen it. But most of you don't have that luxury. But yeah, I think social media is distracting. When I write a book, so I'm trying to get permission to go to Egypt so I can interview Palestinians from Gaza. I'm still waiting for the Egyptian Press Center to authorize it. But when I'm writing, I write from 8:30 a.m. until 2 every day, 6 days a week. But I make it a rule that I don't look at my phone or I don't start answering my email, because you just get sucked down that rabbit hole. And next thing you know, it's 30 or 40 minutes gone and you have limited energy when you write. So I consciously put up walls between myself. I've said many times I don't have a TV, but I have a computer. So, and I try and read every night. I partly I'm forced to, because for this show, I interview a lot of authors. So I'm probably in the middle of 3 or 4 books as we speak. I'm just finished a novel, a climate dystopian novel, and I'm going to interview that author. So yeah, I try and read at night if I can. I mean, I'll read during the day, and sometimes so I live close to Princeton University and I have access to Firestone Library. And I will often, especially if I'm behind in my reading, just go there with a book. So I don't have my phone, I don't have a computer, and I always sit in the same place, which is under the kind of life-size portrait of Sylvia Beach, who ran Shakespeare and Company, the bookstore in Paris that published James Joyce's Ulysses. She's buried in Princeton. Her father was a minister in Princeton. I don't know. I find that hung in her apartment until she died. I suspect most students who walk by it don't know who she is, but it's my favorite place to sit because she's there. Zicky, Chris, is Trump actually taking on the military-industrial complex, the deep state? If Project 2025 is the blueprint for his administration, isn't the Heritage Foundation filled with neocons and corporatist ghouls who have historically been pro-war and expansionism? Yes, and Project 2025 is not about diminishing the power of the military. It is about expanding funding for the military, and that's why we see in Congress Republicans trying to push through a bill with $100 billion increase in military spending over the next decade. What they are about is destroying the State Department, destroying diplomacy. It's all about using the big stick or using the most brutal techniques of empire in order to achieve what it wants, which is, of course, disastrous. But I don't see any indication that yes, they will get rid of civilian workers, but that work will be outsourced. And that's what the corporations want. That's why they're firing everybody right and left. But I don't think they're going to touch Trump, we saw it with Zelensky today. He loves the power that empire gives him. He loves wielding that power, like all autocrats. Devin, have you ever been threatened by the elite power for speaking out? Or do you not disrupt capital, so you are not a threat to them? Well, I've had moments where it's pretty unpleasant. I mean, when I would denounced Bush's call to invade Iraq. I, of course, was pushed out of the New York Times, but I was lynched is the right word, every hour on right-wing media. My phone bank at the New York Times was filled with death threats. And sometimes, they called in. The Zionists have made my life very uncomfortable. And for instance, I spoke at Dartmouth College, and the Zionists called in bomb threats, and everybody who went into the hall had to go through a metal detector, and the college had to hire extra security, and nobody was allowed to get up out of their seat while I spoke. And the Zionists bust in people. I mean, to Dartmouth's credit, they allowed me to speak, but that sent a message to all sorts of other colleges who don't want the headache. I've been disinvited. I mean, I have a lecture agency, so I was supposed to speak at the University of Pennsylvania, and then the Zionist organized through the Hillel House, was just an APEC appendage, and they attacked me as an anti-Semite, and I got disinvited also at Oberlin College. So yeah, I wouldn't say that I've been certainly pushed to the margins of the media landscape. I mean, if you take a decade ago, voices like mine, Matt Taibbi, Glenn Greenwald, we were within the mainstream. Matt was Rolling Stone. Glenn was at The Guardian. That's all gone. It's vanished. So it doesn't compare in any way to the kind of persecution that dissidents have endured in full-blown dictatorships. But we're moving there. And you've seen an assault against Richard Medhurst. Max Blumenthal got stopped at the airport in question. I was actually stopped once at the Newark airport and not allowed back into the country with a valid U.S. passport for 2 hours. They didn't question me. They put me in a room with, I think, people who had forged visas. And then after 2 hours, a supervisor came over and said to the guy on the computer, he's on a watch. You can tell him he can go. That's all I heard. But it was a message. And the demeanor of the Homeland Security people when I come back from overseas will change. And when my profile comes up, I mean, sometimes they can be very caustic and aggressive. So that's all minor, really. But it's there. I mean, the state is aware of your presence. They don't like your presence. And that's not going to get better. Right now, the Trump administration is focused on the deep state, on the legacy media, on the Democratic Party. But once they finish with them, then it's us. This is Kamishwara Kate. Please tell us the name of the climate dystopian novel you read so we can catch up. It's All the Water in the World. She's a great writer, beautifully written. It's good. And we're going to do a show on it. Mark J. Why won't climate scientists not point out the contribution of the meat dairy industries to global warming? Well, that is a good question, because the animal ag industry is right up there. I mean, some people say it's a larger contributing factor than the fossil fuel industry. It's certainly really large. And the destruction of the rainforest is so they can plant soy for animals, not to mention all the factory farms and everything else. So, yeah, it's actually really important. James Martin, are we going to see a new book anytime soon? You are going to see a new book, but it's not going to be anytime soon. Joe Sacco and I will do a book on Gaza. This was Joe's idea of just a couple of weeks into the genocide. We have to go to the Middle East. It's going to take us a long time to do it. I think both of us feel compelled to do it because, of course, the object of the genocide is erasure, not just the physical erasure of the Palestinians, but the cultural erasure, historical erasure. And both Joe and I have spent a lot of time in Gaza. It's a small contribution, but it's what we should be doing to fight against that erasure. So but when we finish and how we fund it is another issue. So one more question, Max says. Yes, and thanks for getting us to 100,000 viewers. Mark Patrick George, do you really think the U.S. empire is redeemable, and if so, why? And do you think the world might be better off without the U.S. as it is currently configured? Well, I hate empire. I mean, empire, I know. I spent 2 decades on the outer reaches of empire. I know the cruelty of empire, the racism of empire. Empire is the external expression of white supremacy. When I was covering the war in Iraq, the way U.S. Marines and soldiers would refer to Iraqis was, Haji, sand, the N-word, all those it was awful. And empire is a malevolent force, which, most people in the Middle East or the global South understand. Watch my interview with Pankaj Mishra. This is exactly what we talk about. So no, and the other important point, and this is of course central to Sheldon Wollin's argument about empire, is that empire destroys the capacity for democracy, because in order to maintain empire, you need centralized authority. And democracy, or the Greeks call the demos, is only sustainable when power is decentralized. And I lived in Switzerland, where each canton, I studied French in Switzerland, in Lausanne, and each canton has a great deal of autonomy against the federal authorities. But empire can't afford that because it has huge structures that it has to maintain. So the concentration of power is always, and that's what destroyed, Wollin argues, I think correctly, that's what destroyed Athenian democracy, or Thucydides argues that the tyranny Athens imposed on others it finally imposed on itself. So empire is a dangerous, pernicious, and ultimately fragile construction, because empire is sustained by pillage and by the theft of resources. And once those tentacles, once that ability of the empire is taken away from them, then empire tends to implode or collapse more quickly than states that are not empires. And Alfred McCoy, I think, does a pretty good job of explaining all of that in his book, whose name escapes me at the moment. I could probably go find it, but we don't have any more time. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.